Before there was Banksy, there was Mr. Eternity, an anonymous street artist who tagged the footpaths and side streets of Sydney for 35 years. He wasn't making a political statement or highlighting his gang affiliation. Over and over, he wrote just one word: eternity.
This is Signs of the Times Radio with Kent Kingston.
And with me today on the Signs of the Times radio show and podcast, we have Roy Williams, who's co-authored a great book that was just released earlier this year, I think it was, Mr. Eternity, the story of Arthur Stace. How are you, Roy?
Very well, thank you, Kent.
Excellent. Great to have you with us. Now, just looking through the book, wow, it really seemed like in some ways a story of Australian history, but sort of played out through the life of one man. Do you know what I mean by that?
Well, yes. In fact, lovely to hear you say that, because that's really what I was trying to do. Tell an amazing period of Australian history from the 1880s to the 1960s through the life of this sort of quintessential Aussie battler.
Yeah.
So he lived through both of the Great Depressions, 1890s and 1930s, both world wars, including he served in World War One. The temperance movement, the rise of the Labor Party, all these things he lived through, and they all made an impact on his life.
Okay, can you just give us a thumbnail sketch of the life of Arthur Stace, going through those periods? I mean, you mentioned the earlier Great Depression, the 1890s one. He was born at around that time, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was born in 1885 into a very poor working-class family in inner Sydney, and lived until his first 7 years in slums, really. Both of his parents were alcoholics. It was a really as tough as it got. The kids had to steal food from doorsteps, shop counters, no real schooling. And then in 1892, so that's during the Great Depression of the 1890s, his father deserted the family, which was a criminal offence in those days.
Yeah.
And his mother was in a hopeless state, evicted from their rented slum, and she gave up all her children except one for adoption or foster care. And Arthur was shipped off to Goulburn, country town near Canberra, at the age of 7, and he lived there for 7 years. That's, by the way, incidentally, Kent, the place where he almost certainly learned how to write, at Goulburn Public School. That's where that famous copper plate came from.
Okay, his copper plate script, yeah.
Yeah, then he worked down the coal mines on the south coast of New South Wales.
And narrowly avoided a fairly major mining disaster, I seem to recall from the book.
That's right. So at the Mount Kembla mine, he was down there sort of late 1890s, early 1900s, and in 1902, one of the worst industrial accident still in Australian history occurred in one of those mines in which Arthur worked. He escaped it by just a couple of months.
Wow.
Providence or fate, call it what you will, in action. A repeated motif of Arthur's story.
Yeah.
Anyway, he survived that, but he took to the grog himself, just like his parents and his brothers and sisters. So by his early 20s, he was a drifter. Came back to Sydney, started working for his sister's brothel in Surrey Hills. Fell in with some really tough crowds.
Goodness me! So he managed to escape that mining disaster, but he certainly didn't escape the depression that he grew up in, and he certainly didn't escape World War One, did he? He was sent off to be a part of that war, which was supposed to be a war to end all wars, or it certainly felt like it at the time.
Yeah, well, in fact, he volunteered in March of 1916. We found his AIF service records. like a lot of sort of battling Australian working class men of that era, he probably saw it as his last chance in life. The AIF pay was very good. Conscription was looming anyway, and so amazingly, even despite the carnage on the Western Front, which was well known by then, he volunteered and ended up as a stretcher bearer in France in 1917. Did that for a few months, but then he contracted pleurisy. So this is another example of providence in action in Arthur's life. He was certainly very ill, and ill enough to be taken off the front, but not so ill that he died. So he survived the war, came back in 1919, and then spent the 1920s really as a shattered wreck of a man.
They used to use that phrase shell shock, didn't they? I guess today we might call it PTSD, but a lot of guys who came back, from that First World War and the Second World War really had a lot of psychological difficulties, and I guess he'd already had a weakness for alcohol, and I imagine that wouldn't have ended at that point.
No, it got worse, in fact. I mean, he was effectively unemployable. He by his own admission, he spent as much time in the gutter as out of it. He was a regular at the Darlinghurst and Redfern police stations, spent many a night in the lockup. And so by the time he got to the age of 45 in 1930, so that's the beginning of the Great Depression, he was just a ruin of a man. Wow. Completely hopeless.
Incredible. And you mentioned the temperance movement before. Was this around the time when it was decided that alcohol was just causing so many issues in Australian society that they started to shut the pubs early, and this created this sort of 6 o'clock swill phenomenon? But
yes.
I know I forgot my history, right, time-wise, but what was that all about?
Well, it really started in the late 19th century, and it was a movement very much involving women, progressive women, and the Protestant churches. As you say, it wasn't a wowser movement, although that word came to be used against them. It was really a progressive, charitable movement. As you said, Kent, the scourge of alcohol was very real. It was ruining families. The Stace family was just the perfect example of it.
Yeah.
And it tended to strike the poor worse than anyone else. And so you had leading figures, including a man called Robert Hammond, who was an Anglican minister in Sydney, very prominent man. He led the campaign in 1916 during World War I for 6 o'clock closing of pubs. That was voted in by the people of New South Wales, overwhelmingly. And
that's really interesting.
Stayed in force until the 1950s, even 60s in some states.
Yeah, I actually remember watching it not very long back, a show on ABC TV where they have a family sort of living through the decades, and they started off in the 50s, and this sort of mention of the 6 o'clock swill and how ridiculous it was that the pubs shut so early, but there was no talk of that history of where it came from, the damage that alcohol was doing earlier in Australia's history, and the fact that it was a progressive women's movement and as you say, a vote, a sort of a plebiscite that actually brought this into force.
Indeed. In fact, it's an amazing part of Australian history, and we forget. I mean, in the United States, of course, there was complete temperance, prohibition from 1920 to 1932. And although that never happened in any state, there were votes of 40% plus for prohibition in Australia in that sort of era. And when you look at the sort of damage done by alcohol, you can begin to understand why. And Stace, as I say, was just the perfect example. And in 1930, so we now come to sort of the first huge day in his life story. In August 1930, the 6th to be precise, he took himself along to a meeting at St Barnabas Church on Broadway, for down and out men.
This is in Sydney still, yeah?
Run by this fellow R.B.S. Hammond, who by then was a leading figure in Sydney society, a very esteemed man, head of Protestant charitable efforts in Sydney, and known to governors and premiers and sort of loved by all. He was also an evangelist, and he had this Wednesday night meeting every week where if the men were prepared to sit through a gospel sermon for an hour, they got supper. And Arthur always said, look, I went along for a feed. I went along for a cup of tea and a rock cake, and I came out with the Rock of Ages.
Yeah, okay.
He was converted that night by Hammond's sermon, probably from Luke 18, the prayer of the repentant publican.
Oh, yes. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner.
God, be merciful to me, a sinner.
Mm-hmm. Wow, really powerful.
Yeah, he swore that that night, and this is obviously the Spirit moving in him, that night he just had this overwhelming conviction of his own sinfulness, hopelessness, and he said that prayer in Victoria Park, just across the road from Broadway, just adjacent to Sydney University, under one of those big fig trees, and he never touched a drop of alcohol for the rest of his life.
Wow, that is a miracle, isn't it?
It is a miracle because, of course, those sort of cold turkey cures from addiction of any sort are extremely rare, always have been and always will be.
Mm-hmm.
But in Arthur Stace's case, there's no reason to question that that's what happened.
Wow.
I really tried to run a fine-tooth comb over this story and separate fact from myth.
Yeah.
The fact that Arthur changed and converted in that year is attested to by all of the historical record, all the witnesses.
What I really like about this story, Roy, is that at that point Arthur Stace didn't sort of float off in a pink cloud of glory and sort of go to nest in a cathedral and never came forth again, but instead he became an intensely practical and active Christian in the community.
He did. So first of all, he cleaned up his own act. He very quickly went and saw Reverend Hammond, and Hammond put him to work through the 1930s in various charitable operations that Hammond was running. And Arthur was perfect for that because he could relate to the very sort of men that Hammond was trying to help, alcoholics, unemployed, derelicts, and so forth. And Arthur had this knack of getting their confidence and helping them in a practical way. But he also became very involved in his church, initially the Church of England, but they weren't quite fiery enough for him, so he moved over to the Baptists in the late 30s and stayed there for the rest of his life. He also got married, and had a very happy marriage. He got paid jobs eventually, very humble jobs, caretaker, cleaner type jobs, but, he held them down and responsibly. All this time, of course, from 1932 onwards, he was conducting this amazing mission for which he's famous for.
Yes, and that's what I wanted to get onto. So he attended another Christian meeting, didn't he? And he heard a sermon that just struck his heart, and it was the beginning of something that has become legendary even to this day. Tell us about that.
Yes, well, still during the Depression, 14 November 1932, Arthur, by a young Christian now, took himself along to a special sermon being run out of the Burton Street Baptist Tabernacle in Darlinghurst.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the visiting preacher was a man who became a very, very famous and eminent Australian evangelist, one of the greatest of all time. John Gotch Ridley was his name. And Ridley, by the way, was a fellow survivor of the Western Front. In fact, like Arthur, he'd won the Military Cross, though, and come back a war hero, and then devoted his life to the Baptist Church. And by 1932, he was a really hard-hitting figure. And he preached that night on the theme of eternity. Isaiah 57:15 was his verse. That's the one in which God himself is described in the King James Version as he who inhabits eternity. Okay. And Arthur was just struck dumb by this powerful sermon. And incidentally, for your listeners, if you want to hear a recreation of that sermon, you can go to the Bible Society's website, and listened to it.
Oh, right.
Ridley redelivered it in 1970, and it was recorded, and it's a priceless sort of artefact of Australian Christian history. It's really quite amazing.
Okay, and
anyway, Arthur from that night was again moved by the Spirit to write the word eternity in chalk on the streets of Sydney every day for the rest of his life.
Okay, so but the preacher had this particular line that I've heard quoted over and over again. It's something along the lines of the preacher said, "Oh, that I could, shout the word eternity over the streets of Sydney," or is it something along those lines? And that's sort of been a line that's been particularly recalled.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. So that's how Ridley ended his sermon. It was unscripted, that part of it, because we've actually got the notes of his sermon. But that part was off the cuff, and that seems to have been the line that may well have inspired Arthur. He said, well, Reverend Ridley said that, I'm going to do it. I'm going to write it on the streets of Sydney.
Yeah.
And he used to get up at dawn every morning, before dawn actually, pray for an hour and then roam around, mainly in the inner suburbs, but he later on branched out and covered most of Sydney by the end of his life. Every morning he did it.
So just writing this word, eternity, over and over again in chalk usually, or sometimes crayon? Chalk.
He later turned to crayon because he reckoned it stayed longer on the footpath. It was waterproof.
Yeah.
And it's amazing because after some years, this became famous, even though no one knew who was doing it. He did it for 24 years anonymously.
Yeah.
And it became like a real talking point in Sydney newspapers. I trawled through the newspapers of the 40s and 50s, and for a long time before Arthur's name was revealed, there was comment about this phenomenon and speculation about who was doing it and why. And eventually the story was broken to the Sydney papers in the mid-50s. And so for the last 11 years of his life, Arthur was a public figure and invited to speak at all sorts of places and interviewed many times, lots of further media articles about him, and bit of a legend in his own lifetime.
Wow. Did he have, during those interviews, an opportunity to explain what he was trying to achieve by writing this word eternity over and over again? What was he hoping to spark off in those who saw that word?
Yes, he was. And in fact, there's a surviving radio interview that again can be heard on the Bible Society's website for those interested. Arthur was asked that very question, and he said he reckoned that we're all on this earth for a purpose. And he saw his purpose, one of them, has been to remind people that there's an eternity to face. That's what Ridley's sermon had all been about. There's an eternity to face, and everyone's got to do it individually.
Yeah.
And he was really just trying to prompt that thought in people. So, of course, for him it was a one-word sermon, but the word was so resonant that it came to appeal not just to believing Christians, but to everybody. Everyone who saw it or many people who saw it, got thinking and about the nature of time and mortality and our place in the universe, all those, the toughest, most important questions of all. And Arthur, this, humble battler, did it as well as anyone. He was taught by these great men like Hammond and Ridley, but ultimately he reached probably more people than anyone.
Wow.
Culminating in of course that great moment on New Year's Eve 1999, turn of the millennium, where the word eternity was used on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, part of the celebrations.
Do you know anything about the process that led to that decision being made? Is that something
I sure
that you explain in the book?
That's another thing we tracked through in the book. That so what happened was it's a really good story of how God works. So when Arthur died in 1967, there was an initial flurry of publicity, but then then his name wasn't exactly forgotten, but, the legend kind of
faded.
Faded. That's right. But then, incredibly, it was revived in the 1990s. There are a number of factors at play. Probably the most important was a partnership between famous Australian artist Martin Sharp and a Sydney entrepreneur named Remo Jouffre. Remo opened a trendy merchandising store in Darlinghurst in 1990 called Remo, which still operates online. And his best-selling item were T-shirts with just Arthur's word "eternity" emblazoned on the front.
Okay.
They still sell really well. And he had this store in a very prominent position in Oxford Street. And Martin Sharp had done these big paintings with eternity written on them. He learnt about the eternity story and became fascinated by it. And together they sort of they brought back the Stace story to a whole new generation of people, including movers and shakers in that inner Sydney cultural scene.
Yeah.
So through the 90s, you got a raft of uses made of the eternity story by people like Sharp in painting, tapestries. You had a documentary film made in 1994, a very good one, which went around the world actually, and was screened at the Sydney Film Festival. You had poetry when these blokes were, Ignatius Jones and others, were planning the Millennium celebrations and the Sydney Olympics ceremonies. They thought of this word, which seemed to sort of capture everything about the turning of the millennium, and it was a great Sydney story that most people recognised, and that's how it came to be used on the bridge. Wow! And then, of course, the legend took off. It was supercharged
all over again.
Since then there've been operas written about Arthur, countless art exhibitions and novels have made use of it, more poems. It really is quite extraordinary, the extent of the cultural legacy that he's now left.
Wow, yeah. Look, that is incredible. It really reminds me of a verse in the Bible, in the book of Ecclesiastes, that says, God has placed eternity in the hearts of men. And it really seems like, as you say, all kinds of people resonated with this message and got a sense of, hey, we need to look beyond the everyday activities that we have. There is, something larger at play here. We need to sort of look beyond and look to eternity. It's really powerful, yeah. And look, and I know Adele Nash, who wrote a review of your book in the July Signs of the Times magazine, really enjoyed it, had a lot of really good things to say about it, and I know she and a lot of other people have really enjoyed it. Is that what they're telling you?
Well, that's very kind of Adele, and great to hear. We've had some terrific feedback from all kinds of people, including more elderly people who remember Arthur. Some remember actually seeing him in the act of chalking. A few remembered actually talking to him. And all sorts of great stories. But it's also fantastic, perhaps even better, to hear from really, the new generation of young people, teenagers, for example, at my church, who are reading this story for the first time. And learning about this great Australian Christian, parts of perhaps our history that they've never interacted with before, and just the whole, as you said, Kent, this whole unbelievably deep of eternity. Yeah. It just appeals across the board. Once people start actually thinking about it seriously.
Yeah.
That was my number one aim in writing the book.
Yeah, sure. And I guess the one thing that really jumps out to me, I guess, is just that life transformation, that he was a guy, born into poverty, and ending up without parents, effectively an orphan, and into crime and into addiction and all this sort of stuff. The sort of guy that a lot of people would have completely written off, and we see through this story of a life turned around, a life transformed, and I guess for me that is hope. That's hope for anyone out there struggling with whatever problem it is. That if you look at his story and see what God was able to do with him, then perhaps none of us is beyond God's reach.
That's absolutely right. None of us is beyond redemption, no matter how hopeless your situation might seem. It's not hopeless. It's not hopeless. That's the difference between the Christian view of the world and all other views of the world. One of my favourite stories, and there are so many of them, about Arthur is this one, that there's actually a cafe in, of all places, Moldova, Europe, part of the old Soviet communist bloc, that has a place in it called the Eternity Cafe, set up by Australian Christian missionaries. And they found that when they told the story to the people of Moldova, it resonated hugely, and the reason they kept getting was they could relate to alcoholism and poverty. Yeah. And those aspects of the story just were absolutely universal, and therefore, the evangelistic power of Stace's story, cuts right across just Australia. It's gone around the world. Mm-hmm. No, I love that story.
Yeah, no, it is incredible to think that such a quintessentially Australian story can have such deep resonance elsewhere. And look, I really hope that people over the world do enjoy your book, Roy, because I know, I certainly did, and Adele, who wrote the review for us, certainly did. So yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to tell us a little bit about it. And where can people get hold of the book?
Well, it's well stocked at Koorong, any Koorong store around Australia. You can get it online at through the Bible Society or through Acorn Press, their website,
or Amazon, I imagine.
Certainly Amazon. Yep, and there's an e version if people prefer to read it that way. But I personally like the paper version. There's some beautiful photos in there of both photos of Arthur's life and also the sort of cultural spin-offs of eternity that we've been talking about. Wow. Some lovely colour photos as well.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Roy. Really appreciate your time, and all the best. Looking forward to your next book.
Thank you, mate. Yes. Well, I'm working on it.
Okay. God bless.
Cheers.
Today's episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A subscription is just $26 for 11 issues a year. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au. Signs of the Times has been published in Australia since 1886 and is proudly produced by Adventist Media.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.